This did not begin as a trade war. It began as a single policy decision that moved faster than the system could absorb. When Washington announced the decision to double steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, the effect was immediate and violent across North America's industrial spine. Supply chains that had taken decades to stabilize cracked open almost overnight. Buyers froze. Contracts stalled. Long-standing assumptions about reliable partners suddenly felt fragile. By August 1st, Canadian steel exports were facing an additional 35% tariff outside USMCA protections. Markets reacted before diplomats could explain. Steel buyers panicked. Manufacturers scrambled to secure inventory. Rail traffic slowed as orders evaporated. What had once felt permanent now looked provisional. This moment was not just about tariffs. It was about timing. Steel is not a flexible commodity. You cannot reroute production on a whim. Automotive plants, pipeline projects, and infrastructure contracts are designed around predictable material flows. When that predictability vanished, the shock rippled outward into pricing models, labor schedules, and financial forecasts. Hot-rolled coil prices surged to $900 per ton within 2 weeks, a $150 spike that caught buyers flat-footed. Traders began whispering about a metal-driven slowdown. Wall Street noticed. The S&P 500 slipped as analysts recalibrated earnings tied to manufacturing exposure. What Washington framed as leverage landed instead as disruption. And disruption, once released, does not obey borders. No region felt the impact faster than the American auto belt. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis are deeply integrated with Canadian steel supply. The F-Series truck alone consumes roughly 1 ton of steel per vehicle. Canada ships up to 12 million tons of steel annually into U.S. manufacturing, much of it feeding Detroit's production lines. When tariffs hit, those flows stalled. Rail shipments slowed to a crawl by mid-July. Steel yards stopped moving inventory. At Ford's River Rouge complex, stamping operations were idled as material deliveries dried up. The pipeline that had powered Detroit for generations snapped without warning. Michigan's unemployment rate climbed to 5.4%, the highest in the country at the time. Layoffs spread. Expansion plans froze. Suppliers pulled back. The damage was not theoretical, it was measured in missed shifts, paused lines, and silent furnaces. Across the river in Windsor, anxiety traveled faster than official notices. Auto work defines entire communities. Families remember what collapse feels like. A fourth-generation Ford employee described each shift as carrying the weight of potential shutdowns, not knowing whether the next delivery would arrive. Consumers felt it next. As steel costs approached $900 per vehicle, automakers raised sticker prices. Popular models jumped by $1,500 to $2,000. Vehicles assembled in Mexico saw increases approaching 25% as supply chains scrambled to compensate. This was not punishment aimed at executives or foreign governments. It landed squarely on factory floors, dealership lots, and household budgets. Ottawa did not respond with noise. There were no sweeping counter-tariffs, no dramatic press conferences, no threats aimed back across the border. Instead, Canada moved with speed and calculation. Within 48 hours, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $1 billion initiative to modernize and decarbonize Canada's steel sector. Coal-fired blast furnaces would be phased out. Electric arc furnaces and hydrogen-based production would take their place, powered by Canada's hydroelectric and nuclear capacity. Officially, it was framed as environmental progress. Strategically, it was something else entirely. Cleaner steel meant access. Cleaner steel meant compliance with future regulations already written into European law. While others scrambled to adjust, Canada aligned itself with where demand was heading, not where it had been. At the same time, Ottawa imposed strict quotas on steel imports from countries without free trade agreements and slapped a flat 25% duty on Chinese steel. Canada would no longer act as a dumping ground. Domestic supply would be protected. Public procurement became another lever. Canadian-made steel was reserved for federally funded infrastructure. Housing, transit, pipelines, provinces followed. Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan mandated domestically melted steel for projects ranging from rail spurs to industrial valves. Jobs stayed home, supply lines shortened, Mills powered by low-carbon energy gained a structural advantage few competitors could match. Canada was no longer waiting for orders. It was positioning itself as a gatekeeper with options. While North America was still arguing about tariffs, Europe was already enforcing the future. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism was scheduled for full implementation in 2026, and buyers were not waiting for the deadline. Steel with high emissions profiles would soon face penalties, delays, and higher costs at the border. Compliance was no longer optional, it was a prerequisite. Canadian steel fit the requirement almost perfectly. Thanks to hydroelectric and nuclear power, large portions of Canada's steel production already met emissions thresholds that many competitors could not reach without massive reinvestment. By some measures, Canadian steel was more than 90% emissions compliant. That detail mattered. European buyers moved quickly. Contracts flowed in from the EU, Japan, and parts of Southeast Asia as firms rushed to secure steel that would not be penalized under future rules. What began as a North American trade shock quietly turned into a global export opening. This shift was not driven by diplomacy, it was driven by regulation. Steel buyers care about predictability. Once emissions standards were locked into law, sourcing strategies changed overnight. Canada did not need to advertise. The market adjusted on its own. Exports to the United States began to fall, not because Canada withdrew, but because alternatives became more attractive. European demand offered stability, long-term contracts, and pricing that reflected future compliance rather than short-term disruption. Canada's role in the industrial hierarchy began to change. No longer a junior partner tied almost exclusively to American demand, Ottawa was writing a playbook that aligned production with regulation, energy structure, and future trade architecture. This was not retaliation. It was recalibration. South of the border, the pressure compounded. Ford's leadership warned Congress that the tariff regime would cost the company $2.5 billion in a single year. Steel costs per F-Series truck approached $900 per unit, eroding margins at a pace that could not be absorbed indefinitely. Dealerships adjusted the only way they could by passing costs downstream. Sticker prices climbed, financing stretched, demand softened. Consumers who had already absorbed inflation across food, housing, and energy now faced higher vehicle prices, driven not by scarcity but by policy friction. The impact spread beyond autos. Texas oil drillers found themselves short on pipe as Canadian suppliers redirected output toward domestic infrastructure and overseas contracts. Enbridge began cannibalizing older inventory to keep projects moving. Smaller contractors were shut out entirely, unable to secure material at viable prices. Political pressure mounted in Washington. On July 21st, a group of U.S. senators urged Ottawa to ease what they called a metal blockade. The language was revealing. Canada was no longer being addressed as a partner, it was being treated as a choke point. Ottawa did not yield. Carney offered narrow quotas that preserved Canada's advantage while avoiding open confrontation. There were no broad concessions, no symbolic gestures. Canada leaned further into alternatives. Europe absorbed more shipments. Asian buyers lined up. Even when U.S. steel prices dipped slightly in July, Canada held its edge through volume stability, emissions compliance, and long-term contracts extending through 2027. One side focused on immediate barriers. The other focused on where demand was heading. The gap between those approaches was widening. The steel confrontation was not an isolated case. It was a preview. In early 2025, Washington launched what it believed would be a decisive financial strike against Venezuela's oil sector. The goal was simple: cut off revenue, isolate buyers, and force political collapse through economic pressure. On April 20th, sweeping secondary tariffs were announced. Any country purchasing Venezuelan oil would face a 25% tariff on all exports entering the U.S. market. Electronics, agriculture, consumer goods, no exceptions. Chevron's operating license was revoked at the same time, removing more than 100,000 barrels per day of heavy crude that Gulf Coast refineries were designed to process. On paper, the calculation looked airtight. In reality, it repeated the same strategic flaw. The attempt to isolate Venezuela did not end its oil trade. It redirected it. With competitors exiting under threat of penalties, prices softened and access widened. China stepped in quietly at first, increasing purchases through intermediaries and ship-to-ship transfers. Then came the shift that Washington did not anticipate. In September 2025, China moved beyond buying oil and took operational control. Under a rare 20-year production sharing agreement, Chinese firms assumed control of more than 500 Venezuelan wells. Engineers, equipment, and capital flowed in. Output began climbing rapidly, with projections reaching 60,000 barrels per day by 2026. This was not opportunism. It was preparation. After upgrading relations to an all-weather strategic partnership years earlier, Beijing already had the political and financial framework in place. Sanctions did not corner Venezuela. They cleared the field. Once again, pressure created a vacuum, and once again, someone else filled it. Once China stepped inside Venezuela's oil fields, the balance shifted permanently. This was no longer about buying discounted barrels under the radar. It was about controlling production itself. Under the 20-year production sharing agreement signed in late 2025, Chinese firms assumed operational authority over more than 500 oil wells, including fields long considered dormant or unviable under sanctions. Engineers arrived, equipment followed, drilling resumed. Production that had collapsed to roughly 12,000 barrels per day began climbing rapidly. By early projections, output was expected to reach 60,000 barrels per day by 2026, with further expansion planned beyond that horizon. This recovery did not depend on global prices or Western approval. It was built into infrastructure and debt. Over the past decade, Venezuela accumulated more than $60 billion in loans from China. These debts are not repaid in currency. They are repaid in oil. That distinction matters. Barrels committed to debt service are locked in before they ever reach open markets. Sanctions, price swings, and diplomatic pressure do not interrupt repayment flows. By late 2025, as much as 90% of Venezuela's oil exports were moving toward China, either through direct shipments or layered maritime transfers designed to avoid detection. Shipping data from December showed exports climbing to nearly 1 million barrels per day, the highest level in almost a year, with China absorbing almost all of it. In November, Beijing reinforced the relationship by signing a zero-tariff agreement covering hundreds of product categories, pulling Venezuela deeper into China's industrial ecosystem. This went far beyond energy. Debt, infrastructure, and manufacturing supply chains became intertwined. Venezuela was no longer just an oil supplier. It was an integrated node inside China's long-term energy strategy, insulated from external pressure by structure rather than defiance. Washington could restrict routes. It could threaten buyers. But it could not nullify oil already pledged to debt. Control had shifted quietly, and it was not coming back easily. Taken together, the steel and oil episodes tell the same story. Power no longer belongs to the actor willing to strike first. It belongs to the actor prepared to absorb disruption and turn it into leverage. Tariffs and sanctions create shock, but shock does not guarantee compliance. More often, it creates openings. Canada did not confront Washington head-on. It repositioned. By aligning production with emissions standards, securing domestic demand, and diversifying export markets, it reduced dependence without violating existing agreements. The result was structural resilience. China did not challenge sanctions rhetorically. It outlasted them. By embedding energy access inside debt and infrastructure, it transformed vulnerability into control. Pressure accelerated a shift that was already underway. The contrast is stark. One approach relies on immediate barriers, political signaling, and short-term dominance. The other relies on alignment with future rules, patient capital, and system-level integration. For workers, the consequences are personal. Factory towns absorb uncertainty long before balance sheets adjust. Careers stall, housing plans pause. Young tradespeople question whether the paths they were promised still exist. For governments, the warning is sharper. In a fragmented global economy, leverage is no longer applied at the border. It is embedded in standards, energy systems, financing structures, and long-term contracts. The next phase of competition will not be decided by who can impose the highest tariff, but by who understands where demand, regulation, and supply are converging. The question now is not whether disruption can be created. It clearly can. The question is, who is prepared when disruption arrives, and who will be forced to react after the damage is already done?